the communists were premature anti-fascists, as the line used to go, which is, of course, a literal untruth. It's not like Lenin and Stalin are murdering all these people personally. Rather, they were able to mobilize in some ways the most discontented or alienated members of society and to arm them and to get them to commit really these kind of heinous crimes against people. So, Hollywood doesn't always get everything wrong. But yeah, I think that the popular version is just obviously, it's just wrong. A lot of points it's historically wrong, and it's also deeply misleading.
Well, great. Yeah, well, it's great to have you on the podcast. We're really excited to chat with you. I'm curious. We're sort of already talking about this, but how did communism and that sort of topic as a whole become your thing, your project?
I mean, in some ways, it's kind of where I started, and then I came back to it after years of working on First World War, Second World War, Russian Revolution, other topics that maybe are related to communism, but maybe not quite tackling in this direct frontal sense. I grew up in the late 80s, and so for me, it was just it was in the air, it was in the atmosphere, the discussion about the Soviet Union, about communism. We even had a rather eccentric, brilliant history teacher of AP American history. And we would do this rather elaborate reenactment of the Army McCarthy hearings every year. And I think the idea of the exercise was supposed to be to get us to reckon with the abuses of civil rights in the McCarthy era. Is very kind of traditional, more or less liberal American perspective. But some of us actually would take it a little bit further, and we would try to root out communist influence in the various student organizations, some of which, in fact, most of which were fictional, of course. We would create acronyms, things like the Socialist Hockey Association. My own personal favorite was the Committee for a Red Brigadoon. That was the musical we put on my senior year. And so the idea was we would sometimes go a little bit overboard. This is right after the camcorder was invented, and so a lot of us had fun with the camcorder, and we'd go around, we'd interview colleagues, associates, siblings, and sometimes find out about someone's nefarious connections to various kind of underground societies. And to some extent, we were just having fun. But I also was enraptured by, I think, some of the kind of the intrigue of the subject. I hadn't studied Russian yet, so I didn't necessarily have the ability to go and do any research in the archives. But actually, a year or two after this, again, somewhat farcical kind of encounter with the history of communism and communist influence organizations, the Library of Congress did this exhibit called Revelations from the Russian Archives. This is in 1992. It happened to be the year I was graduating high school, and so I actually applied for a grant. And believe it or not, it was the grant was given to me by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I still have, I think, the paper with the signature of all people, Lynn Cheney. So this is not Liz Cheney. This is Lynn Cheney, who I believe was then chair of either the National Endowment for the Arts or the Humanities or this or that. And my subject was actually the Great Patriotic War, which is to say the Soviet contribution to the Second World War, such as it was the Eastern Front. Amazingly, it turned out there were 6 Red Army veterans living in my hometown of Rochester, New York. And so I actually went and I interviewed them, although because I didn't know Russian yet, I mostly had to use an interpreter, although they all spoke a little bit of broken English. And amazingly, I mean, all 6 of them were actually missing at least one limb. One was missing, I think, 3. So I got a sense of the brutality and just the savagery, of course, of the war on the Eastern Front. But also, their stories, none of them really matched up. It wasn't kind of this simplistic, oh, well, we fought off the fascist invader. Some of them had actually started off the war in Poland and then been deported and then ended up somehow impressed into Red Army uniform. They all came from different regions of the Soviet Union. They all had various different perspectives on communism, on the system. None of them were, I mean, I suppose it stands to reason because they ended up in the U.S. They weren't fervent communists, and they also found American politics, I think, rather trivial. They kept saying, like, you get all hot and bothered over these elections, but you will have enough to eat. To them, it was like they were coming from this country where starvation was just this ordinary kind of experience and something you almost expected in the course of events that your government would horrendously mistreat you, and that you may or may not kind of die in a famine or dysentery or some other illness related to malnutrition. So I mean, it definitely marked me, but it was frustrating too because I didn't know Russian yet, and so I had to go learn Russian, and kind of took me years to finally get into the archives in a serious way. But that was kind of my burning brush for most of the past few decades is the revelations from the Russian archives. The frustrating thing now, and it's a little bit wistful, I think, thinking about it, is that effectively I can't really go back. It's not just because of the war, but the archives were already beginning to close down to some extent. But my employer, Bard College, has actually been listed as an illegal and undesirable organization in the Russian Federation. And so while if I tried to work in the archives today, I would probably just get deported. Anyone who collaborated with me might be subject to arrest. Now, in practice, I doubt that would probably really happen. But I have colleagues, Russian colleagues, who work with me at Bard, and they have to be extremely careful in their movements. We apparently can't even correspond with people inside Russia because then they might be subject to prosecution and arrest. Again, in practice, I doubt it would happen, but at least that is what the law says. And so it's a bit frustrating now. I mean, luckily, there's so much material that was already microfilmed, copied, vacuumed up by repositories from Harvard to the Hoover Institution at Stanford. I have material that I've been assembling over the decades. So some of this is also just being able to use all the material I have, which not all of which I was able to use in previous books. But that was a very long answer, I think, to a fairly simple question about how I came to be interested in the subject.
No, it's a great history. Those first folks that you interviewed, did they have conflicting accounts of their time in the Soviet Union, or was it just different perspectives?
I think it was mostly just different perspectives. It wasn't like there were any real political fireworks. It's just, that is to say, on the one hand, obviously they had all suffered, and most of them had been, I suppose, wounded by presumably either Germany or her allies on the Eastern Front, but they didn't bear any particular ill will towards any country, and they didn't have any particular patriotism or pride in having fought for the Soviet Union. They were mostly just trying to survive. But they were interesting to talk to just because the stories were so harrowing. And I mean, it kind of instilled me a abiding fascination with the subject, with the country, but also with the experience under communism that they'd all lived through.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as I was reading Stalin's War, and I haven't read your latest book yet, but you probably get into there. I'm curious, do you think that sort of the temperament of the Russian people, you had mentioned at one point in Stalin's War, or a firsthand account of saying that they were, very religious, and also somewhat, docile in some ways. Do you think the temperament of the Russian people was particularly suited to be the breeding ground of communism, or could that have happened in any place?
Well, that's a really tough question. I mean, I wouldn't want to obviously inflict a system like this on anyone. I don't think that Russians are necessarily naturally inclined towards this type of totalitarian system, but there is a certain, I think, fatalism in Russian culture, an ability to endure, almost to accept the kind of the cruelties and the whims of fate, some of which presumably goes back to their national experience, not just under the Tsars with autocracy, which was not as extreme as communism, but which was still fairly authoritarian, where there weren't really a lot of outlets for democratic organizing, popular sovereignty, and so on, or earlier on under the so-called Golden Horde, the Mongol invasions, this almost kind of habituation to a type of despotism. I mean, there's a very different mentality. I sometimes tell my American students, those who probably haven't experienced Russia these days, it's even less likely they will experience visiting Russia or the former Soviet Union, that their idea about maybe it's even a little bit of a myth, but we all believe it to some extent, that anyone can achieve almost anything. That is, that if you put your mind to it, you can be all you can be. That was the old army slogan. Or you can perhaps found a company, or these days, I suppose, become an influencer, whatever the latest trend is. This would strike a lot of people in the former Soviet sphere as naive and kind of just wrongheaded. The idea that we all control our fate and we can do anything that we choose with our life. That is, that we're sort of buffeted about and our choices are not always our own. in this sense, I think there was this phrase actually in a really interesting book published in the 70s by a New York Times journalist called Hedrick Smith. Probably, I think it was his masterwork, but just called The Russians. And one of the points that he made in the book, he had a whole chapter, he called it Longing for a Strong Boss. And one could see this almost as patronizing, but the idea that there's a kind of passivity or fatalism inherent in the Russian character. I think he obviously is overdoing it to some extent, but there's something real there. That is this, on the one hand, it's the capacity to suffer and endure. And you can see this in Russian military history. I mean, the Russian grunt, the kind of mujik soldier, has never been necessarily renowned for the type of elan or maybe dynamism of some of the West European armies that Russia would often face, but their ability to endure hardship and sacrifice and suffer. And you certainly saw that in the Second World War. You saw it maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent in the First World War. It was almost unmatched. That they somehow were able to kind of see things through. There's definitely something to it. I mean, it's, in the end, I suppose, and we could talk about this later, but the collapse of communism to some extent obviously reflected at least a little bit of ornery rebelliousness in the character, at least of those Russians who were willing to go out and demonstrate in 1991. But generally speaking, the rule has usually fallen in the other direction. That is to say, while Russians at times have kind of seized fates in their hands, oftentimes they simply kind of accept the cruel whims of fate under autocratic or totalitarian regimes, which frankly maybe is just the only way you can really handle it. I mean, you otherwise you despair. You have to have some way of just kind of enduring the hardship, which I'm not saying this to rationalize or to make it okay, or even to say the Russians are to blame for what has often been done to them by their cruel governments. Rather, I think it's a little bit of maybe a natural evolution, because they have suffered so often from these types of governments. They've become adept or perhaps inured to that type of suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. We were chatting yesterday about how do you get from the Dostoevsky's you said Tolstoy or Dostoevsky's Russia to Solzhenitsyn's Russia, and it's such a fascinating. Yes, that's what you described. It's a very interesting evolution in a people, in a country. I'm curious. So taking a step back before we dive into your latest book, To Overthrow the World. My sense, maybe I'm wrong, but this is just as a reader of your work. My sense and how I first came to even learn of your writing was there's sort of a popular Hollywood version of the myth of communism, insofar as it fits in the World War II narrative of that just people in America know, And then there's Stalin's War, and then there's To Overthrow the World. There's sort of the nuanced, detailed, dive into the archives version. Does that seem accurate? And if so, would you be able to maybe summarize what the pop version of communism is, and then what you're trying to do with your project as a whole, with your books and your writing around this subject?
Sure. Well, I mean, I suppose the popular version of communism, on the one hand, there just aren't as many movies about communism or about the Soviet Union as there are about Nazi Germany.
And we'll get to that question.
But, right. But, you have Reds and all these legends going back to John Reed about this kind of heroic workers' uprising. I mean, I don't think most Americans, perhaps more of them, are beginning to see things this way. That is, traditionally, I think most Americans were at least reasonably skeptical about this kind of roseate view of communism that you sometimes saw in these Hollywood movies. Or there was a kind of the counter myth too about the McCarthy era. There are probably more movies about that than there are about Soviet communism. So, the idea that the communists were kind of these misguided idealists, that they were the original anti-fascists. In some ways, I think you actually see it more prominently in the literature on the Spanish Civil War. A great example of this, let's say in the movie Casablanca, where part of the backstory about Rick Blaine, so that we know he's on the side of the angels, or at least he was before he fell in love and had his heart broken. But he used to be on the side of the angels, and then, of course, he's back on the side of the angels at the end of the war, was that he, quote, fought against the fascists in Spain. So there's this line, which is, first of all, I think, misleading about Franco and who Franco was and what his forces were actually fighting for. They really weren't fascists. Franco wasn't a Nazi. He wasn't an anti-Semite. It's true he got support from Mussolini and the Italian fascists, so one sees where it comes from. But if anything, he was kind of a traditionalist, more of a kind of Catholic monarchist, almost a mystic, someone who really probably would have been happier living in the 19th century than the 20th. He was absolutely not this kind of radical fascist figure. But of course, it's also romanticizing the side of the Republicans in the Civil War, the side supported by the communists, armed by the communists, and frankly looted by the communists, because Stalin looted the entire gold reserve in exchange for the limited supplies of weapons that he sent there. So in some ways, I think this is kind of the anti-fascist myth. So that the communists were premature anti-fascists, as the line used to go, which is, of course, a literal untruth in that, in fact, as soon as Hitler acquired power in Germany, seized power, was basically handed power by Hindenburg at the end of January 1933, the official position of the Communist International was effectively that this was fine because the real enemy were the socialists, who weren't communists. They were called social fascists. They were a more dangerous enemy. And so the Nazis weren't even necessarily seen as particularly a threat. This didn't actually change until more than 2 years after Hitler achieved power, when they created the Popular Front in 1935. So I think in the broadest sense, there's this very vague sense of the communists as the premature anti-fascists. And sure, maybe some of their policies were a little bit wrong-headed or misguided, economically speaking, but they were kind of on the side of the angels because they fought the Nazis. And of course, you also have to neglect the nearly 2 years during which Hitler and Stalin were actually allied under the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop, actually Moscow Pact, between 1939 and 1941. The various times at which the communists actually opposed war against the Nazis, including in France, where the communists actually told French people not to resist the German armies. So there are all kinds of anomalies that just don't fit this kind of vague, feel-good narrative about communists as these sort of premature anti-fascists. Or you might say, let's say, going into the story of the Eastern Front, to the extent most people in the West know about it, they know that the Russians and the other Soviet peoples suffered a lot in the war. They know that much. They feel almost this kind of gratitude for their sacrifice, almost this kind of heroic blood sacrifice. And you don't even really see that. I mean, honestly, there are, aside from maybe, I guess there was a popular movie about Stalingrad, which, oddly enough, I thought Stalingrad, the Jude Law film that came out about 20 years ago, I can't remember the director, I thought it did a pretty good job of at least trying to contextualize some of what was really going on the Soviet side. The moral ambiguity and darkness, they obviously exaggerated for effect, as Hollywood often does, but there's this famous speech where Khrushchev is rattling on about, how we need to execute more people, and this is the only way we can get the men to fight. So Hollywood doesn't always get everything wrong, but yeah, I think that the popular version is just obviously it's just wrong. A lot of points it's historically wrong, and it's also deeply misleading. I think in the end, the Soviets fought in the Second World War because they were invaded, full stop. I think had Hitler not invaded the Soviet Union, we don't really know what Stalin would have done, but it definitely would have complicated the narrative.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so what do you see as sort of that's the popular narrative? What's the general aim of your project? Where do you want to, maybe change the railroad track rail?
Sure. I mean, maybe in some ways just to de-romanticize communism, that is, to make it comprehensible as it actually existed in practice. Although obviously the first third or so of the book is about ideas, what I call the theory of communism, the various thinkers that tried to spin out the various scenarios under which they thought that the workers or the proletarians, as Marx called them, would seize power. Again, even there's just the broader sense of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that it might have been a dictatorship, but at least it was a dictatorship of the workers. Whereas I explain, even in Marx's own lifetime, critics such as Bakunin, this famous Russian anarchist, had kind of sussed out what Marxism really meant in practice, which was statism. That is to say, an all-powerful state, probably more powerful than any state had ever been before, controlling and directing and surveilling the people in all these extremely aggressive ways, which would eventually become, of course, 20th century totalitarianism. That is, in order to abolish private property, in order to level the playing field, in order to create a so-called equality of conditions, required this kind of panopticon state, which would be able to not just basically steal property from whoever had it and redistribute it in some slightly complicated way to supposedly ensure social equality, but which would also have to surveil the people and make sure that they were not dissenting from the party line. You would have to direct the economy, which required these huge planning bureaucracies. Now, we all know, most of us know, at least, I mean, those who study the history a little bit know that it didn't really work that well in practice, but it's good to be reminded that, in fact, as late as the 1960s and 70s, a lot of Western intelligence agencies, most famously the CIA, actually thought that planning actually did work. I mean, we really, in my own lifetime, this actually used to be a more mainstream economic position, really, until the 1980s, the belief that, in fact, planning was more efficient, and eventually the communists would conquer the world in part because of superior economic performance. I think most people today now know that was kind of a chimera, but for a lot of the 20th century, people really did think that Marx was onto something. In fact, even mainstream economic departments, although probably you'd say the mainstream position was a little bit closer to liberal Keynesianism. Marx's imprints were all over the economics profession in the 50s and 60s, and people really genuinely did believe that some variety of a state-directed planned economy was the wave of the future. But yeah, part of what I'm trying to do is both demystify, but also I think deglamorize, de-romanticize it. In practice, what this actually means is, you get some armed revolutionaries who, if they happen to be lucky enough, in the case of Russia, in the case of other countries devastated by war, if they are able to seize power in part because of just the breakdown of social order, what it actually means to abolish private property is to rob and loot people at gunpoint. And what it means then to direct the entire economy is basically to choke off a lot of what is ordinary kind of human life and ordinary human activity and redirect it so that the state and the government controls everything. And it leads to, of course, this kind of grotesque tyranny, but it also leads to all kinds of really kind of odd anomalies and just strange results that couldn't have been predicted by anyone. And you got a lot of different versions of this. I mean, eventually, once a lot of these regimes discovered that it really was hard to direct the entire economy, and you couldn't do away with money, for example, and you couldn't do away with the black market, and you couldn't do away with this. There was at least a little bit of grudging tolerance for these things. And so in some ways, the statist energy would go elsewhere, such as in, the Cold War era. I talk a lot about the sports doping complex, where at least if we can't plan every single economic activity over a vast continental landmass like the Soviet Union, at least we can create this kind of extremely successful state sports and kind of doping plan, and then coordinate over the different countries. It's all about planning. I mean, it's basically about intellectuals kind of being put in charge of these committees in order to control other people. In the end, it's kind of very sordid in practice, but you just can't get rid of this kind of statist ambition. It's so central to communism.
I think if you asked a lot of people about the origin of communism, they would say something like, "Oh, well, it started out as a pure idea, like John Lennon's imagined people, wanting what's best for everybody, and then somewhere along the way it went bad." In your research perspective, what's your opinion on that narrative? Were those sordid elements there from the beginning, or was it more of a transition point?
Well, I think they're there at the beginning. They're there right in the doctrine. I mean, it's kind of amazing if you even read the manifesto of the Communist Party. They're literally talking about confiscating the property of immigrants and rebels. They're literally talking about theft. It's right there in the program. So the idea that somehow these people abused Marx and his doctrine and his theories, or to give you an example, of course, Marx himself never acquired this type of political power in his lifetime, but the closest example in his own life was the Paris Commune of 1871, which is not perfectly communist. They didn't abolish all private property, but they at least tried to have greater state control of the economy. There was a kind of populist element with a little bit of redistribution and a little bit more of a statist element too, where they were arresting people and having bourgeois hostages and all this. And a lot of people might expect that because it was not perfect communism, that Marx might have distanced himself from this and said, well, look, this isn't exactly what I meant. But no, he said, this is exactly what I meant, because yes, they are seizing hostages and they're throwing women and children into battle and they're burning down buildings. And there's all this horrific violence and they're executing people in cold blood. Yes, he said, yes, this is exactly what we need. He embraced it. He endorsed it precisely because it was violence. The violence was inherent to the vision. You look at Lenin. Lenin is channeling Clausewitz in his wartime writings. He's kind of combining together Marx in his theories about communism and Clausewitz in his theories about war in order to basically turn politics into sublimated warfare. And not just class war between the haves and the have-nots, but literally warfare between the communists and everyone else. He spins this out in great example of this, one of Lenin's lesser known works, the military program of the proletarian revolution. That's literally what it's called, the military program of the proletarian revolution, published in 1916, in which, he said a bunch of things. One was the current imperialist war, as he called the First World War, this war between kind of the European capitalist empires. He didn't shy away from it because it was violent. Rather, he thought it was great that it was violent, because eventually, it would get arms into the hands of the so-called proletarians. Basically, they'd create these kind of mass mutinies, and in the weakest chain, or the weakest kind of link in the chain, which turned out to be Russian, he more or less predicted that they'll come to power. But then once they were in power there, on the back of this violent civil war, then you'd have one communist country, and then the rest of the countries wouldn't be communist. And so they would inherently be in this state of war with each other. I mean, it's a little bit like the Islamic idea about the house of peace and the abode of peace, the abode of war, this kind of perennial kind of dualism where you have two sides that are unalterably opposed. And so you'd have the communist countries and the non-communist countries, and they would be in this state of war. It might be a hot war, it might be a cold war, but basically you would eventually get a whole series of wars engulfing the earth. And, millions and millions of people dying in horrific ways. And he wasn't saying this in the sense of like, oh, I hope this doesn't happen. He was saying, yes, this is exactly what we want to happen. It's interesting. Like, there used to be a little bit of this good Lenin, bad Stalin idea. You would hear sometimes like, oh, well, the early revolution was fine, and then Stalin betrayed it because he was some kind of a reactionary or something. And it's not just wrong in the sense that we know far more about what Lenin actually said and did, and there's little secret left. But even in Russia, curiously enough, they take the completely opposite line. I mean, even Russian kind of nationalists and chauvinists today, they've completely disowned Lenin. And this is partly because they see Lenin as a destroyer, someone who basically kind of brought down the Russian Empire and, basically promoted civil war. And the civil war, which kind of brought down the empire, even if it was later reconstituted, partly under Lenin, but then more specifically under Stalin. Stalin, even if most Russians today don't necessarily support all of the apparatus of Stalinist repression, but they still see Stalin as something of a builder. They see Lenin as just a destroyer. But again, in the West, I don't think that's the way people have usually seen it. There was maybe a little bit of naivete, or sometimes there was this line, let's say, in Stephen Cohen, a late professor at Princeton, and some of his ideas and views I think were quite reasonable and plausible. But his idea of some alternative, more humane version of communism is the so-called Bukharin alternative. That basically, because they abandoned full-on integral communism in 1921 and 22 with what was called the New Economic Policy, where they actually had to re-legalize a lot of aspects of what we might call capitalism, from the grain trade to small-scale retail and kind of artisanal shops, and eventually even the service sector and almost everything except what Lenin called the commanding heights of the economy, which were foreign trade and heavy industry, the military-industrial complex, and the banks. Everything else was more or less re-legalized. But the problem, of course, was that wasn't communism. I mean, they had to make a decision. Are we just going to give up? Or, as Stalin eventually decided, no, let's try to build it. And so, of course, the Stalin version was kind of communism par excellence. In some ways, it wasn't quite as extreme as under Lenin, because they'd given up on abolishing money, and they even went back to kind of a little bit of a competitive wage structure. Managers and engineers were paid more and all the rest of it. But the objective was still to control the whole economy, to direct it, to plan it, to basically build this communist system. So, yeah, I mean, I think it was there from the outset. I mean, to get back to your question, I think it was always there. It's inherent in the ideas. And it was there literally at the outset in Russia. I mean, even in Lenin's slogan, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. He was not promising a pacifist utopia on Earth. He was promising a brutal war, and that's precisely what, of course, he brought about.
There are a few rabbit trails that I'd love to pursue. One is just a comment. I was just telling Josh yesterday, you brought up Islam. I just recently read Raymond Ibrahim's Defenders of the West. Sword and Scimitar, 14 centuries of war between Christendom and Islam. And it was interesting reading your new book, To Overthrow the World, just how much, in some sense, it felt similar to this sort of insane threat that just rises out of a group of ideas, a group of, it's just sort of this, like, it goes from an idea to a world religion that just aims to take the world by fire. And all of a sudden, nations just have to reckon with the fact that this new massive, cult of ideology just exists, and you have to defend against it. Anyways, that just struck me, sort of the similarities there.
No, I mean, there is a real parallel there, and the fanaticism of the early believers is also something that you obviously see with communism. And I think there are obviously some differences. I mean, one of the things you saw in the Soviets, at least by the 60s and 70s, is even though they're still building out this, of course, massive, terrifying arsenal of ICBMs and weapons and conventional arms in Europe and so on, a little bit of that kind of crazy fanatical elan seeps out of the leadership, in part because they get older, and it's not entirely clear whether all of them still believe in it. Oddly enough, Gorbachev was one of the last, I think, true believers who really did think you could build communism, whereas I think a lot of the other members of the Politburo and the KGB on drop off. Sometimes the best informed people were coming out of the secret services. Beria, for example, who almost tried to liberalize the system in the early 50s, and for his troubles, of course, they arrested him and then murdered him rather brutally. He basically saw that the Soviets were failing, and that to some extent the economy was never going to be competitive with the West. So there were definitely those who kind of were backsliders, or maybe who weren't quite as fanatical. But I suppose you could see that in Islam too. There are obviously periods of dormancy, periods of the fanatical belief when it looks like they're all conquering, and then with the Ottomans, particularly after the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, a lot of that kind of fanatical energy seems to seep out, or at the very least, the capacity isn't there. I think that was probably the other thing. And that's where maybe the Soviets were, if not as fanatical, they were a bit more dangerous, and it was in part because, of course, they married this world-conquering faith with technological prowess, so that in the end, they did create the ability, ultimately, of course, to essentially eradicate all life on Earth. Fortunately, that didn't happen in the Cold War, but at least the possibility was there. Whereas the armies of Islam, it seems like, never really were able to quite marry that technological prowess to the fanaticism of the believers. In fact, to some extent, maybe the two things are almost antithetical. It was certainly possible to be a true believing communist and also an atomic scientist. I think that was a little bit harder to achieve, probably, for the more fanatical Muslims. This famous example from Ottoman history, even really at the height of the empire's power and prestige, and the era of Selim, the Grim, as we usually call him, Yavuz Sultan Selim, and then Suleiman Kanuni, Suleiman the Magnificent, that 16th century. The obscurantism is already coming in, with the bans on non-government printing presses, effectively cutting down printing, and then most famously with the destruction of the astronomical observatory of Taqi al-Din in 1580. So the obscurantism ends up undermining the kind of the technological element, where the armies might have become a lot more powerful or threatening. So it undermined the capacity, even if the desire might have been there to conquer the world. Whereas with the Soviets, there really was a time when it looked like those armies and the Soviet weapons and the expansion of the Soviet Empire and the dispatch of technicians and advisors to satellite regimes around the world really did seem like an all-conquering threat. In retrospect, the line is, well, yes, but they were upper volta with rockets because the economy was rotten from within. That's certainly not how it looked in the 60s and 70s, and that's not what the CIA was saying. They got a lot wrong, but we shouldn't discount the idea that there was some threat, I think, posed by the Soviet Union and the Soviet armies, and certainly by Mao in China as well. With those armies that kind of fought the Americans to a draw in Korea, and then once Mao got his own nuclear program going, Mao in some ways had all the fanaticism that the Soviets maybe were beginning to lack by the 1960s. So I think that threat was real, and married together with greater technological progress was maybe even a greater threat, I think, to the countries of the West. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I guess partly as you're talking, I think of passages I was reading in your book and just my general cursory study of communism. What makes it so different at a glance is that at its core there's a bunch of resentment, it seems like, and that resentment turns into murderous envy so quickly, or can turn to murderous envy so quickly. I mean, I was struck. I was telling Josh this yesterday about the sort of modern conception of a communist is a trust fund kid that's at Harvard, but secretly pretends to be poor and embraces communism, and I didn't realize that Marx was essentially, in some ways, this kind of person himself. Yeah. And a bunch of the early communists were the same way, where they're inheriting a ton of money or getting a stipend from their parents, or if that stipend evaporated, then somebody that liked them would essentially, it was a patronage network to keep giving them money, and then there was that event you can probably describe it in more detail. You can't describe it in more detail, but I was telling Josh about it yesterday, where when Marx and Jenny, his wife, move into this very fancy apartment, and right at the same time he seizes. Well, you can describe the event, but the bizarre duality between the figures that are espousing this ideology and the lives that they live secretly, and the
pleasures that they throw a library ball, a very fancy dress party at ball, and it's almost simultaneous to Marx's founding of the first Working Men's International Association, the predecessor to the second, founded in 1889, then the third, the one that Lenin founded, the Communist International of 1919. Marx, the way I try to explain it in the book is this idea of almost the kind of the déclassé bourgeois intellectual. He's not highborn enough to really be a person of kind of social consequence. He's also not a successful career person of any kind. I mean, he did get a doctorate, but he didn't get an academic job. He did dabble in journalism, but he never really made much money out of it. He relied largely on handouts and inheritance and kind of sympathizers paying him money. I mean, what was interesting about Lenin, although of kind of a similar background, kind of the minor nobility, and again, a little bit of a kind of a downwardly mobile type, that is, someone who is filled with resentment, maybe in part because they think they're entitled to a greater life than they're able actually to achieve on their own merits. Lenin's innovation in some ways, and I think part of the reason why he was so successful, aside from his embrace of kind of the study of war and applying Clausewitz's ideas about war to politics, he also came up with this idea, sometimes called Vanguardism, but the idea that, the intellectuals have to run things, basically, because they're the only ones with the time on their hands to read the books. And to kind of further that along, to make it clear, both that we have to have this intellectual vanguard of intellectuals who are thinking the thoughts and coming up with the right doctrines and so on, but they actually have to get paid. I mean, they literally talk about this, the professionalization of the communist revolutionaries under Lenin. So they become salaried. My very first book, which has not really been read by that many people, was about this German communist called Willy Münzenberg, who actually got to know Lenin in Switzerland in the war. And I made a big deal in the early chapters of the book about this moment when in his case, he actually had been a worker. He had actually worked in a shoe factory, sorting out scrap leather and that sort of thing. But there's this key moment in his life that comes, and then he had to be an apprentice in a kind of pharmacist shop. When he stops working and he's put on the payroll, he becomes a professional revolutionary with a salary. And, then his life just becomes, I suppose in his sense, he probably thought he was doing more important work, but, effectively he's just this kind of political activist, right? He's in today's world, he'd be writing a lot of emails, right? He's constantly sending out letters, and he's organizing meetings, and, he's putting together placards and posters and riling people up, and, trying to get everyone to, and what's kind of funny about it in a way too, is it becomes ever more abstract. It's not about like, let's get better conditions in your factory. It's like, no, you've got to study up on the Turco-Italian War, and you have to learn about the latest geopolitical developments, and you have to have opinions on them all. You have to become a news junkie. Like, that's really what these people were kind of in practice. Marx himself, he's always writing about world historical events, the Franco-Prussian War, the U.S. Civil War, all these kind of huge Russian invasion of Poland, crushing of Polish rebels. It's always these things. It's never sort of like, what are the conditions like in this factory? He didn't really have a lot of interest in that. So on the one hand, you have this social type, as you were alluding to, the kind of almost the angry, resentful, downwardly mobile, déclassé bourgeois type, the ones who were leading the movement. But, I shouldn't make it sound like it's just these people, though. I mean, I think the thing that made communism so effective and also dangerous and murderous was that once these people were able to manipulate, indoctrinate, propagandize enough discontented people, usually soldiers. I mean, that's the other thing, of course, in Russia and these other places. Mostly the propaganda is working among soldiers who maybe had reasons for resenting their mistreatment by officers, or some of the less pleasant aspects of military discipline, or perhaps supply problems and poor rations and that sort of thing. It was among the soldiers, sometimes, yes, among the factory workers too, but oftentimes among the unemployed, or those who were just kind of cut adrift, or even in some cases in the prisons. They would let some people out of the prisons. So, the most kind of socially disconnected individuals would get enraptured by the message, but also, I think, frankly, by the lure of violence. This is the thing you can't really explain. It's not like Lenin and Stalin are murdering all these people personally. Lenin in particular was something of a physical coward. I don't think we can really say that about Stalin. Rather, they were able to mobilize in some ways the most discontented or alienated members of society, and to arm them and to get them to commit really these kind of heinous crimes against people. Like a large part of what made the Stalin era in particular, I think, so murderous was also this. They even had this in the Communist International. I should say it wasn't always the déclassé intellectuals. In fact, a big theme of the propaganda of the Stalin era in the late 20s and early 30s, right up through the Popular Front, was this idea of kind of a class from below, where they would be promoting the less intellectual types, people like Ernst Thälmann in Germany, for example, and they were trying to take over the reins of the party. The ones who either had some working class origin, or maybe used to be workers, or at the very least the ones who just weren't the kind of the fancy pants intellectual types. And you can certainly see this in the Stalin era with the purges of the 30s, that a lot of the people purged were those old déclassé bourgeois intellectual types, the party elites, the original party members, the kind of the old Bolsheviks, as they're sometimes called, people like Radek and Kamenev and Bukharin and so on. And the people who emerge in the Stalin era, they may or may not be true believers, but they're a little bit more like, thugs, basically. They're the people who really kind of enjoy the violence. They're the sadists. And they're the ones who then become fiercely loyal to Stalin, again, in part because of ideology, but also I think just in part because they're promoted. They're promoted to fill all the dead men's boots, the people above them in the hierarchy. And so eventually you also got a social leveling even inside Soviet communism. And maybe that was inevitable. Again, you kind of started with these angry, alienated intellectuals, and then eventually you got thugs and criminals, the ones who just kind of really enjoyed tormenting their betters.
So how that's something that's fascinating to me. Like, how does what you just described, that system of essentially you promoting the most violent people to who drawn to the peaks of the violence, how does that, especially in America, in the early 20th century, how does that gain prestige? Like, why is it about communism as a ideology that is embraced by like the intellectual class as something that's cool and kind of sophisticated to hold?
It is something that's hard to explain. On the one hand, I don't think it was the thuggishness as such that was appealing to people. On the other hand, we have these strange anomalies. For example, you might expect that the more humane period of communism in the 20s of the new economic policy, where they at least allowed some level of private enterprise, that would be the time that more Western intellectuals were sympathizing with and becoming what Trotsky called the fellow travelers, papuchiki. No, in fact, that was not the time. In fact, communism lost a little bit of its glamour appeal when they gave up on utopia. Rather, it was in the Stalin era. That's when you actually saw the height of the fellow traveling and people joining the party. Now, some of that was, to be fair to at least some of the people who were joining these kind of committees in the mid-1930s, some of it was, again, the anti-fascist myth we talked about earlier. The idea, after the Popular Front, at least you can say, well, they're against Nazism and they're against fascism. But more broadly, I think it was the pose of communism to be this kind of modernizing force led by intellectuals. The very brutality of the regime towards the peasants in particular was a kind of a selling point. Again, in a way that might seem bizarre or strange to us. But Marx had this famous line about the opium of the people or the opium of the masses. He meant religion, but more than that, he meant this kind of stupefaction and the innate conservatism of the peasant. He even wrote about this in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, his work about French history, basically the fall of the Second Republic, which then ends up in the Second Empire by 1851 after the Revolution of 1848. Marx's theme, and it's a little more subtle than Marx. He actually was not a bad historian. He was actually kind of describing something real, why most of the peasants voted for this guy called Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, even though he'd spent most of his life outside France and didn't even really speak proper French just because his name was Napoleon. So the idea he was the nephew of the original. The idea is like, well, they're dumb. Basically, they're superstitious, and he kind of admitted, well, sure, a lot of them did well under the first Napoleon, so it's not completely irrational, but basically, it's kind of this kind of almost thoughtless, innate conservatism of the peasant. And the Russian communists, once they were in power, I mean, they carried this out in kind of brutal practice. The idea that the peasants were just in the way. Briefly, they adopted the more popular position of the Socialist Revolutionary. That was Kerensky's party, more of a peasant populist party. Briefly, again in 1917, with their peace, land, and bread trinity, what they claimed they were going to do was to adopt something called the consumption labor standard, which was closer to the old Russian idea about the commune, where you would kind of divide the land allotments amongst those with larger families or more families to feed, this kind of idea of almost a moral economy. They didn't mean it, though. They just adopted that for reasons of political expediency. The Marxist program, which everyone remembered from the manifesto, in which the Bolsheviks, the communists in Russia absolutely supported, was state control of agriculture, which is a very different thing, which required effectively going to war with the peasants over the food supply. And they tried this in the early years of the revolution. They had to give up by 1921, basically just because so many people were starving. They had to admit it. You couldn't actually hide the fact that you have maybe 30 or 35 million people starving to death. They even hired, of all people, Herbert Hoover and the American Relief Administration to help feed. They blamed him at the same time they hired him, but they realized they needed his help because so many people were starving. Then they tried again, of course, under Stalin, and that time they more or less succeeded. They didn't completely eradicate private plots in all of the Soviet Union, but they absolutely did go to a lot of the prime agricultural areas of Black Earth Russia and Ukraine, in particular, most famously Ukraine with what we now call the Holodomor, and then also places like Kazakhstan and Central Asia with a more nomadic economy. And they created these kolkhozy, these kind of collective farms, these state farms, which were both planned and they were meant to be mechanized. And of course, this produced vast amounts of misery. Again, most people didn't really know that much about it at the time. I mean, to be fair to some of the Western intellectuals, there was a movie that came out a few years ago called Mr. Jones. One of the first really serious efforts by, it wasn't Hollywood, it was a film financed by Ukraine and Poland, although it had a few reasonably well-known Western actors in it. Peter Sarsgaard was he was the greatest. He played Walter Duranty, the New York Times journalist who famously was given a Pulitzer for lying about the Ukrainian famine. And the New York Times still refuses famously to give this back, although they periodically meet to discuss the ethics of it because they realize that he absolutely was lying, that he actually told friends at the time, I think maybe 10 million people are starving. But in the paper, he said, Ukrainians are hungry, but not starving. But anyway, this movie was one of the first efforts to grapple with this. And they talk about this Welsh journalist, he was a political advisor and journalist, Gareth Jones. Malcolm Muggeridge actually broke the story before Jones did, but before their reporting, people had no idea really what was going on in the Soviet Union. So to some extent, maybe people didn't understand the extent of the suffering. Rather, what they were catching up was this whiff of a regime which was kind of on the side of progress. They're industrializing, they've got these plans, they're building factories and blast furnaces, and if the peasants are being kind of crushed underfoot, then that's good, because the peasants are sort of these backward, superstitious, religious people. And so for a lot of modern intellectuals, they thought this was great. I mean, after all, what the communists were doing was just an even more ambitious version of what a lot of economists were starting to talk about in the West, which was a more rational way of kind of mastering the business cycle and smoothing it out. In the Depression years, everyone seemed to think that capitalism was in crisis, and so you needed more state intervention in the economy. And eventually, Keynes popularized a lot of those ideas with his great work on the general theory of Interest in Money was in 36, I think it came out. And eventually Keynes kind of conquers the economics profession with a softer version of this, that the state is supposed to kind of smooth out the business cycle and figure out how to use its tools to better plan out economic development and growth. So a lot of people already believe in some general idea that basically the intellectuals knew better. And in the Soviet Union, they didn't just know better, they knew best of all. they were planning everything. And you can see why this might appeal to an intellectual, that, if only they would put me in charge of society, I would do a better job than, all those greedy capitalists. I would figure out how to make a better and more just society. So I think that's what really appealed to people. If people were being crushed underfoot, they either just didn't want to hear about it, or they weren't really interested in it, or maybe even for some of them, that was part of the appeal.
Yeah. That's fascinating. One thing that, as I'm thinking of sort of like the modern forms of communism, even popular communism, I don't mean the conception of it. I mean actually the embracing of it. So as I'm reading the book, communism is aimed to the workers. It's aimed to the soldiers. It's aimed to whatever else you might say. It's these people who are actually doing things. They're mostly men who are out there working, soldiering, fighting, marching, whatever the case may be. The modern communist, as it were, is either, like we were saying, a trust fund kid on one hand, or on the other is somebody that works just enough to pay their to be able to DoorDash food to their apartment,
or doesn't work,
and just like stream video games all day and browse TikTok. How does that happen? Where old communism is, at least, if it's very bad, it's not an apology for it, but it's aimed to the working man, the man who's doing something. Now it's sort of adopted by the nobodies, the schlubs. How does that? What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I should say it wasn't only, I suppose, the workers and the soldiers who were kind of targeted by the propaganda. I mean, there were other elements, varieties of feminism, for example, liberalizing divorce and abortion laws, at least in the early days. There were, some of those aspects, you could see why those might appeal to a broader swathe of the social spectrum, that some people might say, well, now look, they're also going against the church and they're empowering, again, intellectuals, and you get the state controlling education. But I think in the end, what the appeal you're talking about now, maybe in the West. I mean, I had a Russian friend, who used to talk about this, and we would talk about the nostalgia that some people have in Russia, or these former communist countries in Eastern Europe, Ostalgie, as they used to call it in Germany, the nostalgia for communism. There's this famous German movie called Goodbye Lenin, where part of the appeal, the joke is that this woman has a stroke and loses consciousness, so she doesn't learn about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the doctor says she can't have a shock, and so the children go about doing this elaborate charade pretending that East Germany, the DDR, still exists, and part of it is that she doesn't want to see that there are now 20 types of pickles on the shelves of the store, but only the one type that the Spreewaldgurken. Those are the only pickles that she remembers. Well, anyway, I was talking to this Russian friend about this, and he had a great line because he was himself more of the dissident persuasion. And I said, is it true that some people really were nostalgic for this more orderly world where everything was kind of planned out for you and you didn't really have to think very hard and there wasn't a lot of choice? And he said, yes, if you like living in prison. And that's a great line, in part because he obviously didn't like living in prison. But the curious thing is that some people actually do. I mean, you have people have studied these phenomena like recidivism and that sort of thing. And I think part of the appeal, of course, is people go back to prison and, you've got regular meals and your housing is taken care of. And you don't really have to think very hard, and your day is kind of more or less planned out for you. There aren't a lot of difficult choices. Some of this does appeal to a certain personality type. And again, it's not maybe the extreme version as being in an actual prison, but of course you have the more open air prison of a communist regime where everything is kind of laid out for you. This is what you study in school. Here are the right answers to all the problems. You join the pioneers, you join the Komsomol. Eventually you join the party. You don't really have to be very talented, really, to get ahead. You just have to kind of mouth the slogans, make sure to vote in all the mandatory elections with only one candidate. And you go to all the meetings that you're supposed to go to, and you clap when you're supposed to clap, and you nod your head when you're supposed to nod your head. And you never fall asleep accidentally or act bored. You're never the last one to stop clapping, all these kind of famous cliches. Maybe you don't have to be perfect, but you just have to be basically loyal and reliable. And you never really ask about, the corruption and what's happening with the party manager who's secreting things away and pilfering supplies. And you never ask about, what happened to that family who disappeared into the gulag, and you don't really ask any difficult and unpleasant questions. So long as, again, you play by the rules and you follow the party line, you do fine. And, again, maybe because it's a communist country, you're not going to end up rich, wealthy necessarily, unless, you happen to be really good at ascending the hierarchy. But otherwise, you've got your apartment. They subsidize the energy, so you're not really paying a market price for a lot of things. You're not worrying about paying for your children's college education, certainly. You've got your 3 ruble vodka, right? It's cheap. Maybe the food isn't especially fresh, but, there's enough of it, more or less. And, your life is fine. I used to read, people used to read, I don't think it's such a fashion anymore, the novels of Milan Kundera. And it was very fashionable in the early 90s. Particularly among women for some reason, but men read them too. And what was really strange about them, they're all about life behind the Iron Curtain. And there was this kind of vague sense of, I wouldn't call it dread exactly, but of this kind of existential doubt in the novels. But mostly people just lived these lives that didn't really seem that unpleasant. They sat around talking philosophy when the bugs weren't there and when no one was listening, and they drank a lot, and they made love and they had love affairs, and that was it, and you could kind of see why this type of life was so appealing to a lot of people, or maybe today, right? The idea of a universal basic income or something like that. Well, maybe people have, maybe they're all on some psychotropic or perhaps some variety of the now legal varieties of cannabis, and all they want to do is just kind of sit around and do as they're told and maybe not do anything. Again, we talked about the passivity earlier in the Russian character, and again, some people are like this in the West too. Some people don't want to have to make a lot of decisions in their lives, and I think the idea of a kind of all-powerful state that provides for everyone. Again, we have a version of that. It's a kind of a softer version of communism. We definitely have that with the welfare state and its various guises. We had it under COVID, right? It looked like suddenly everyone was just happy to. Again, there were people doing the actual work, right? There were people who were actually growing the food and cooking the food and delivering the food and making other things that were delivered to our house with Amazon. It's not like everything happened by magic, but a lot of people kind of thought it was magic. And they're, wait a minute, all these government employees who didn't have to go to work for 2 years in many cases, or private sector employees who pretended to work in various Zoom meetings. A lot of us found it all kind of horrifying that society was shutting down and that everyone was staring at screens all day instead of actually going out and doing things. But there were a lot of people who actually liked it. It's kind of disturbing how many people really liked being told that you couldn't leave your house and being told you had to mask up to go to the supermarket or, to go into an airport or a doctor's office. I guess in California, they're bringing it back, apparently, some of it. Some people actually liked all that. It was kind of shocking to me, right?
It's true. And so many people clung to it and didn't want it to end.
Right.
They didn't want the pandemic to end.
Yeah. It simplified existence so much.
It reminds me of all of this reminds me the quote, most men or many men want nothing more than fair masters. Which I think in Tolstoy's books, you hear, like in War and Peace, he has this like huge tangent where they're just out with the peasants in the countryside. It kind of like takes a break from the plot. And the main character is frustrated that the serfs, kind of like you're saying, like they just want everything to be taken care of at the top level, and they have no, they just want a good master, and they just want to kind of do their little thing with no ambition. And so it is strange in a way that communism is like seems like the dark, twisted version of that, where everything is taken care of, but in a more maybe malevolent, violent way.
Yeah, but no, honestly, until those COVID years, it's not that I was ever skeptical about the history that I'd always studied and the documents that I had read and so on, but I always had a little bit of a doubt in my mind. How would people really go along with this? Why weren't people, kind of clamoring on the cages, or why weren't they out trying to protest when their loved ones are being arrested and deported and all the rest of it? And obviously, a lot of it was just fear. But then I saw what happened when everyone was told that all of a sudden. They weren't allowed to leave their. I heard of these people in New York City who didn't leave their apartments for months. I was just, how can people obey to that extent? They're told that, or the beach thing, right? That you're not allowed to go to the beach. My alumni magazine, somewhat to my shame, I think eventually I went to Stanford anyway. My alumni magazine did a glowing profile of, I can't remember the fellow's name. It turned out I think he came from this very political family, and he was connected to various politicians and foundations and so on. But his shtick was that he went to these beaches in Florida dressed as the Grim Reaper. To try to scare everyone away from the beaches. And this was celebrated, that he was this kind of pioneer in spreading social terror. And I mean, amazing on so many levels that, this is Stanford University, supposedly, this beacon of intellectual life and freedom in the West with, these world-renowned science programs that they also later, we learned, had this internet observatory, basically to kind of censor communication. But here we have the least scientific idea imaginable, that if there's a respiratory illness abroad, the last thing you want to do is to go out into the sunshine and fresh air, but rather you should sit around indoors with other people who may or may not themselves have the respiratory illness, breathing the same recirculated, not fresh air. And that by kind of spreading this idea, he was heroically advancing the frontiers of science or something. And how did this happen? I mean, it was like I woke up in one country and the next day I was in a completely different world. It was stunning. It was shocking.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious about your take on this. I had a similar reaction. I think we all did to those years. It still blows my mind that we just sort of moved on so quickly from that. But what was striking to me then is very striking to me looking back. And it's not just COVID, it's everything from, the corporatization of like DEI and embrace of those kinds of things from like large corporations. It's how there seems to be an amazing compatibility between communism writ large and the professional managerial class or bureaucracy as a thing. Where, like, as you were describing, sort of the existence of the person that just likes a simple life. You check the boxes. You don't stick your head out. You don't create much noise. You just follow the rules. You process A leads to process B to process C. And I'm sorry, this is just policy. It's how things work. Is there a compatibility between bureaucracy as just managerialism and like murder's leftism?
Well, it's a very loaded question. No, I mean, you're right. We sometimes have different phrases for things that are quite similar. I mean, equity is a great example of this, right? So you have DEI, but one of the key words there's diversity and inclusion, I guess. The idea is all kind of, it doesn't really make any sense. They sort of contradict each other. I mean, if you have diversity, then you could accept difference. But of course, the idea is supposed to be that you're not accepting difference. That in fact you want everyone to be the same, or you want equity, which means you want the same outcomes for everyone, which is kind of the opposite of diversity. But I guess what they mean is that certain people are more diverse than others, and so you need to help those have equal outcomes to the ones who are less diverse, or something like that. I mean, there's an Orwellian quality to the language I think many of us have noticed. Equity or fairness, again, is not the idea of equality of opportunity, but something closer to equality of result. But your question about bureaucracy, that's an interesting one. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of people who've written works on the subject of bureaucracy itself, going all the way back to, I suppose, Max Weber. And, the idea that there's something maybe almost inherent in the nature of these sprawling corporate or state bureaucracies that, to thrive in them, you have to be really unimaginative and loyal and obedient. And this is the way we now have these kind of HR departments and the DEI training and the seminars. And obviously everyone is kind of expected to agree with the principles, not to think too hard about them, to accept that it's all for the common good, even if, let's say, a policy is explicitly discriminatory against maybe whites and Asians, for example. It's still in their benefit because it's in everyone's benefit, because we can't question, the goal, we can't question the ideology, we can't question the overall vision. It's become obviously more controversial now. I mean, people are actually starting to push back and to criticize DEI and all the rest of it. So I think there's still some orneriness left in the American character, in the same way that, we saw under COVID, that some people didn't go along and some states didn't go along and even some corporations didn't go along. But I do think there is this tendency, I think, when organizations become large enough, whether you're talking again about the federal U.S. bureaucracy with its 4 million plus employees or however many it is these days. I haven't seen the latest figures, or these sprawling corporate bureaucracies. And I think part of what was so insidious about the COVID lockdowns was that by making, this was already true before the lockdowns, but it made it even true to an even more extreme degree. I mean, they literally shut down competitors. They were shutting down small businesses all over the country, based on these almost bureaucratic algorithms, that had to do with, I suppose not just compliance, but also businesses being termed essential or non-essential. The trouble is, once these bureaucracies grow large enough, and once the mandates and the directives and the laws, they have to hire lawyers for compliance and all the rest of it, they make it so hard to compete for the smaller businesses that, you end up getting a kind of homogenization. And again, I don't think it necessarily is going to end up, or is destined to be, as murderous, let's say, as some of the communist regimes were in the 20th century. But there's a kind of a ruthlessness there. Again, maybe again, they're not rounding people up to be shot or sending them off to labor camps. But, in the COVID era, the government basically just chose winners and losers and decided that some businesses simply had to be shut down, and that effectively didn't matter. Whatever sweat equity you had in, that small shop or restaurant or hair salon or whatever business you had spent your entire life building could just be erased. There's right. There's a kind of a social death there, or an ostracization, or we talk about cancel culture, right? Where, you could rub the wrong person the wrong way, or, you go against the party line, or you get exposed or denounced, and, you can very easily lose your job, which is, again, not the same, as being kind of lined up to be shot or sent off to a forced labor camp. But, it's a coercion all the same. It's again, one might call it softer coercion, the same way that in the latter area of the Soviet Union, rather than, having dissidents shot or put to work at these backbreaking tasks in slave labor camps where a lot of them would end up dying. No, instead, they might be sent to psychiatric hospitals or, injected with psychotropic drugs that had mind-altering consequences. Or, again, they were simply fired from their jobs and forced to fend for themselves, or denied a residence permit. There were softer versions of totalitarianism even under communism. So I suppose we're mostly dealing with the softer kind these days, but that doesn't mean that those varieties of coercion don't still have, I think, serious consequences for people's social lives and their ability to raise families and function in society.
I mean, I think the key was, during COVID, even if the top down, like, you're essential, you're not essential, we're going to shut down the economy, you have to stay in your apartment or whatever. It was it had the mask of neutrality from the mandates, but at the social level, it became extremely moralistic very rapidly, right? Where if somebody did die, you could hear, I mean, not the government necessarily, but your neighbors being like, well, they deserve it, because they didn't mask or they didn't vaccinate. And that's where I was seeing
the president saying you're going to have, what was it, a winter of death?
A dark winter of death and suffering, or whatever it was. A dark winter
of death if you don't comply with our vaccine mandate.
Where it starts, it's technically this sort of just neutral, like, hey, it's for the safety of this. There's no moralistic language as so much from the dictates, but it very quickly becomes this moral binary at the social level.
I was shocked at the way people were starting to talk about the unvaccinated a few years ago. I mean, there really was. It really did seem like they were setting up for some type of a. At times, it sounded quite violent.
Right.
Again, it wasn't just that they were being, they weren't able. In New York City, I didn't take my children into New York City because unvaccinated children, it would be winter. They wouldn't be allowed to enter a building of any kind, basically. I mean, they'd be freezing on the streets. At times it actually did approach a level of almost physical coercion or physical violence, and the rhetoric at times was quite violent. Again, the unvaccinated and the way that they were being talked about, spoken of. Again, it's amazing the amnesia that's now kind of set in about this, the way people were talking about. I mean, I had my children be effectively kind of uninvited to birthday parties where, they were just basically told you can't come here, if you're not vaccinated. And then 6 months later, everyone forgot all about it and said, oh, yeah, it's fine. You can come back. I forgot that I turned you into an unperson last winter. There's no apology, mind you. It's just a kind of amnesiac moving on from, I suppose, a temporary insanity that maybe overcame a lot of people. But I mean, it was quite vicious in a lot of cases. There was a law that I believe is still, it hasn't been enacted yet, but it's still there on the docket in the New York State Legislature. Effectively denying parents even the ability to inquire or to know about what their children may or may not be inoculated or injected with in the schools. Some of these laws that were actually, in some cases, actually enacted, in some cases just discussed or kind of, put on the legislative docket. I mean, they were just kind of astonishing. And we all lived through that, and many of us are still kind of shocked by what happened. And a lot of people, I think, just chose to forget what they were thinking and saying and doing for a short period of time. The way they were treating other people. That's the other thing, just the way they were treating other people. I mean, treating everyone like disease vectors, like lepers. It was a really, I think, disturbing period to live through. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people might have forgotten the way they behaved, but I think they might be willing to saddle up and do it all over again.
Yeah. So, Dr. McMeekin, last question, maybe tying it back to your book. The subtitle is The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism. How do we, as a society, as a nation, inoculate ourselves against a new rise of communism, against things like lockdowns? In your study of history, like, what do people groups, maybe at a local level or even a national level, that resist this influence? Mm-hmm. What do they do well?
Well, it shouldn't be hard in this country. I mean, we have what used to be a fairly robust tradition, both of kind of liberty and freedom of speech. And we have the First Amendment, of course. We have various free speech protections. We used to think England had, if not a First Amendment, then certainly a tradition going all the way back to Magna Carta of kind of limiting of government authority. I think England has more to worry about than most Americans do these days when it comes to free speech protections. But no, unfortunately, I think a lot of people no longer value these things. I mean, public opinion survey after survey has shown that, particularly in the younger demographic, I think it's coming back. I think there's kind of a reaction or a backlash, which is setting in, particularly among the kind of post. I can't remember what all the generations are called. Are we on Z now? We're post millennial, yeah. And then there was Z Alpha. Are we in Alpha now? Is that what we are?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it's like post generation Z Alpha. Maybe there's kind of this resurgence of belief in. Again, it may not be enough, but certainly a little bit of a resurgence in belief of some of our old, more robust traditions of freedom. But working in a kind of a university environment, I value the fact that the president of BART, I think, believes strongly in pluralism and freedom of academic freedom of speech, as do at least some of my colleagues, but not all of them do. Some of them are quite explicit about it. I think that it's increasingly prevalent, somewhat stunningly to me, this idea that freedom of speech must be balanced against, they have various words for this, right? They call it misinformation or disinformation, or I suppose just wrongful ideas or harmful ideas, ideas which might be labeled fascist, racist, offensive in some way, or again, just misinformation or disinformation. I think those words have already begun to have a kind of insidious effect. And so I think people should really be on their guard about that, about hate speech laws, about discussions of disinformation, misinformation. And unfortunately, the thing that maybe we have to deal with, which was not the case a generation ago, is just that the tools of surveillance are so much more powerful now. The social media and search engines, the ability of corporations to track us and monitor us and keep records on us and what we do and what we think and what we buy and what we don't buy and what we say. Those tools are there. I mean, I think we have to some extent, just rely on the good faith, we hope, of our government not to abuse these tools and not to collaborate insidiously, as we saw with the Twitter files, for example, and collaborating with these private or semi-private media companies in order to surveil and censor us. I mean, censorship, I think, is an ever-present threat. I think mostly we need to revisit the history and remind ourselves of the freedoms that we have and that we value and that we treasure, that they're worth fighting for. And we have to be, I think, forever vigilant.
Awesome. Well, Dr. McMeekin, this was a great conversation. We really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was great to meet you both, Santiago and Josh, and good luck to you.
Thank you. And if people want to follow your work, where should they go, or what should they read?
Well, my literary agent, Andrew Lowney, has a good page about all of my books. I'm not a great self-promoter, so I don't really have social media accounts that I really use actively. But my books are all available for sale. I should probably promote my publisher's website, Basic Books. Obviously, a lot of people use Amazon or other purveyors of sellers of books. Most major bookstores should have them, Barnes & Noble and whatever local independent bookstores may or may not exist in your town. But I obviously hope and urge that you can go out and buy this book or some of my other books. And that's really mostly the way that I communicate with the world.
Awesome. And we'll link to both books in the description here. So
thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.